the one of the funny things, and I don't like to jump into rumors, that sort of stuff, but one of the things that's been talked about with this move is, for months, it's been said basically that Riley's, family has bought this charter apparently, and that was kind of an interesting part to this. I have no confirmation on that, so I don't want to go much further in it, but I just think that was discussed. Obviously, that wasn't mentioned in any of this charter discussion and where charter things are at. But I just thought like that is a interesting anecdote to this whole thing, that we haven't heard of that being done before. But if it turns out to be true, possibly one of the smarter things I've seen done in motorsports, and especially in the NASCAR realm, if you're a family who wants to invest in their career and that sort of thing, to get an asset along with it is one of the most genius things I've seen done. If that turns out to be true, I love that. I think it's so smart.
So, and that will actually be. Thank you for bringing something tangible to this conversation, because instead of me pretending like I know anything about the legal issues that are going on, and then probably unfairly, criticizing Denny for his messaging in the last month, that is an interesting storyline to follow, because if the Herpst family is buying the charter, they are essentially using 2311 as the operator of the charter, right? It's like it's an operating agreement, or 2311 is a service provider to the Herpst family for this charter, and that is not an arrangement that hasn't happened yet. What a weird way to say that. That has happened under the charter agreement, right? And it's happened quietly in many different ways. One off the top of my head, and in these scenarios where it's happened, they've had to do some interesting agreements to satisfy NASCAR. But one, for example, was when Joe Falk owned the charter. I think it was the 33 car. Back in the early charter days, he kind of hopped from team to team as like the partner of the team, but he was really just the charter owner. And so, like when he went to LFR, Levine Family Racing, and brought his charter there, if I'm remembering everything right, and you can help me because I don't know how much you knew about all this, but he brought the charter and then they ran it. Right, and they had this agreement that showed that they owned half the charter. But if you remember, when the dust settled, who ended up with the charter? Joe Falk. Right? So, like, however all these agreements were structured to satisfy NASCAR's charter agreement, because they wanted to prove that people weren't just renting the charters out. They had to show that they owned the charter, or that there was a 50-50 ownership in the charter. But at the end of the day, Joe Falk owned the charter. He was hopping from team to team, sort of partnering with the team side as an operator. He was sort of the equity owner of the charter, and then the two would pair together, and then they would run a race car, right? Yep. And then he hopped from, Archie St. Hilaire to Levine Family Racing to BJ McLeod, and it's sort of like, that was sort of how that worked. This could be very similar, right? Where the Herpst family just owns this charter. And they're going to teams, right? It's almost, imagine them submitting an RFP, a request for proposal, to all these race teams to say, all right, we own a charter. Who is willing to operate this charter for us, right? And at what cost? And oh, by the way, the driver has to be our son, Riley. And that is a potential for how that arrangement looks like. And then so you would say the 2311 raised their hand and said, hey, we'll operate that charter for you. If you fund the operations of the race team to the tune of $10, $15, $20 million, whatever it costs, right? If you fund those operations, we will have whatever driver you want drive the car. So Riley Herpst is a driver that will drive the car, and we can approve it through Toyota. They'll approve it as him as a driver. And we can either pay the driver a salary, or you can pay the driver the salary, whatever, it's built into the deal, right? Mm-hmm. And then there will be some kind of arrangement over who owns the sponsorship on the car, right? So who has the rights to sell the sponsorship? Does Herpst still retain the rights to sell the sponsorship? And 2311 is just purely this, service provider for the operations of the car? or does Herpst sort of hand over the sponsorship rights of the car until 2311? You can sell the sponsorship, right? That's part of the deal. So seeing that Herpst, I think, did they announce it with Monster Energy on the car?
Yeah, it's Monster Energy, yeah.
So you could assume that Herpst retained some kind of sponsorship rights or control the direction of the sponsorship with 2311. But that's it. That's an interesting theory to how that could work if Herpst was actually the owner of the charter.
Yeah. And we don't know right now, but it is an interesting thought of just when you've seen, for years you've seen families maybe sponsor the car or that they just provide backing behind the scenes. But to do this model would be really interesting. I know you mentioned it. There's been a couple cases of this. If you think of Spire, when they first acquired the 78 charter from Furniture Row, they ran it with Jay Robinson. Remember that? And he basically operated it for them. And they, serviced it, and then they became a standalone race team themselves.
That is a perfect example of it. They hired Jay Robinson for essentially call it a flat fee, to just say, hey, here's your budget. Go run a race car. We own the charter. And then, at the end of the year, their contract was up. I think it was a 2-year deal they did with Jay. They did 2 years. Their contract was up. And Spire said, hey, we've watched you operate. We've learned about how to operate a race team. We've positioned ourselves to become a standalone race team. So now we're gonna take our operations in-house to where we own the charter and operate it. That's a perfect example.
It does bring up, I know this has been a discussion before of this sort of shadow ownership of these charters, right? And I do believe that there's been some efforts by NASCAR to sort of make it public who owns these, right? Because I think, and I don't know this for sure, and Josh can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in most pro sports, they kind of have to show the ownership cap table and such. And it's not really that required to be public knowledge with these charters. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for NASCAR, right? Should it just have to be public, essentially? Hey, this is the ownership structure of these things. This is the cap tables. To me, it's content, right? Like, if you're going to leave it open, it's content.
I think it's more than just content. I think it's a bad thing that it's not public. I think there should be transparency. There doesn't have to be transparency, but I think there should be transparency in it. And I think NASCAR should want transparency. If I could, push NASCAR a little bit from my perspective, I would say, hey, no, make it public, right? There should be transparency on who owns these charters, who owns the race teams. You want that because it's not just content, it's authenticity, right? It's part of the story, the authentic nature of the sport, right? And if your fans don't trust what they see in front of them, if they think there's more to it and there's things that's being kept from them and cup games being moved and stories that they're not privy to, then they're going to be less interested in the sport. And I think we've seen that, right?
Yep.
People are turned off by the fact of a driver who is obviously a pay driver, obviously bringing money, but is somehow pretending that, like, he found sponsorship, right? Or that they need sponsorship, or they, it's like pretending that the sponsors on their car aren't actually affiliated with them. Like, it's very disingenuous, right? It's inauthentic, and it just kills the story.
I can't stand that. Yeah.
And so
I love it being more open,
Yeah,
like,
and so it just
make it open. Who cares?
And so I think that making that stuff more transparent and open allows the media to figure out the stories and to tell the stories, and then the public is interested because they know the real story, and it holds the whole sport accountable to authenticity.
Yep.
And so there's probably plenty of reasons that things need to be private or can be private, and just because you don't have to make everything public. But I think that in this world, in the world we live in, authenticity is the currency of highest value.
Yeah.
And so the sport should probably make decisions that lean towards authenticity every chance they get.
We want to know who owns them. We want to know who's there. And unfortunately, you won't see either of our names beside any of those cap tables. Not yet. Wait, hold up. Money Lap's coming for one here soon. Back off. We're gonna make it happen, man.